Goku. Superman. 8 long years have passed since that fateful day when two of the Earth's mightiest defenders came to blows and left their inevitable mark on a generation of internet users, with the conclusion of their death battle. So, forgive my lack of composure when I say that this right here, the idea of this death battle in the year 2023, which was once little more than a sparkle in the eye of every hopeful Dragon Ball fan, is a dream come true. After almost a decade since witnessing Goku get his brain turned into mashed potatoes back in 2015, this fight practically stuck with everyone who watched it as a canon event. But even while we continued to watch on through the years, with Goku ascending to a plane far beyond the gods and Superman rising from the ashes, reborn at an all-new peak, it seems that the common consensus right now is that never has a death battle become so outdated, yet so seemingly pointless to remake. Because how could the outcome possibly change? The Man of Steel is said to have no limit and to represent a perfect ideal, whereas Goku is merely a man, meant to trail after bigger and better heights for the rest of time. At least, that's what they'll tell you. But with even Death Battle themselves going as far as to rename that classic Part 2 in their own words as the outdated, inaccurate, and irrelevant sequel, this is all culminated in me deciding to share with you my long thought out answer to this fabled question. An answer that, as a fan of both characters, I've personally been cooking up for almost a decade now. All to explain why, that as the final entry of the Goku Vs Superman Death Battle trilogy finally approaches, things might not be nearly as simple as meets the eye. So, with timestamps down below, this is the full story, the complete breakdown of how Goku vs Superman has changed. Now, for an undertaking this massive, it should be pretty clear that we need to break this video down into some more manageable pieces. So, from this point onwards, I'm going to assume someone conked you over the head sometime back in early 2015, and you are just now waking up from an 8-year-long coma, meaning that you'll probably need a bit of a quick recap, since more than a few major developments have happened since back then. And to start, let's talk about the last son of Krypton first. Since, while he has changed a lot, in the eyes of Death Battle in particular, much less is new about him. So on March 15th, 2017, 605 days after the second Death Battle, Superman would be face to face with a massive renewal in his continuity. A shift which, to explain as best as I can, saw the stories of two separate Supermen being the beloved post-Crisis and slightly less beloved New 52 iterations of the character, basically being swapped out for one another, with New 52 being given the axe, and this pre-Flashpoint Clark being left in his place for a good deal of time. But later, during the events of the comic Superman Reborn Part 3, we saw the conglomerate effects of a hefty dose of plot, divine intervention, and reboot levels of reality warping, all coming together to cause the canon-shattering result of, as the fifth dimensional imp whom shall not be named put it, Deja New 52. In reference to the fact that after this post-crisis Superman had basically interacted with some 5D space MacGuffins, he effectively merged his old New 52 and post-crisis variants all into one body, creating the Rebirth Superman, an iteration of Clark Kent that is often attributed feats from all across his publication history, sometimes even all the way back into the pre-crisis era, where he was still sneezing away solar systems before authors realized they might want to nerf him a little bit. However, the merging of all these old forms back into a single canon effectively retconned countless currently incompatible versions of this character who have never met or didn't previously scale to each other into a single super duper man, which for our purposes is exactly what we need because this is already what Death Battle did for Superman. But now we have an actual canon, at least mildly justifiable reason, to use this said version of Rebirth Superman as our own effective composite Superman of sorts, as he should effectively possess all the skills, strength, and knowledge of those who came before him, and considering how long he's been around, there's plenty to go off of for him. With consistent high-end speed scaling to travel the whole universe in 60 days, with portrayal as one of the few characters who can contend with the Flash, as well as many casual displays of strength for him, like benching the Earth's weight for multiple days without a sunlight charge, or just general scaling and hype surrounding his many clashes with other top tiers over the years, which are all just things New 52 has done, which completely ignores his more iconic and often more powerfully depicted half in the equation of Post-Crisis, who has done ridiculous things like endanger entire realities by boxing with his classic Golden Age variant, with Golden Age himself already being strong enough to deal a finishing blow to the Anti-Monitor, while also tanking his anti-universe channeled attacks, and more than a few of those beyond infinity feats you oh so often associate with the Man of Steel. Plus, of course, for any Superman fans out there, you'd know that the big hype factor featured in the second death battle being Superman's new Solar Flare, a powerful one-time use pseudo self-destruct that took all of his stored up solar energy, ended up being pretty useless, and resulted in New 52 Supes pretty much being axed from the story, as I mentioned, even after numerous buffs like playing around with the idea of the God of Strength power-up. But nowadays, Rebirth Superman not only has access to that ability of massive high-powered super flares, but he's potentially able to use it far better as he's learned to control it with the help of the Justice League, meaning that the loss of his powers as a cost for this OP move is now far more akin to a temporary dip in strength than anything. So generally speaking, this Rebirth Superman is far better equipped to be handling Goku than New 52 ever was, and taking the interpretation that this Superman scales to or above many others in the past, besides his Elseworld iterations, can be perfectly consistent and would imply that this version of Clark is far more in line with the overpowered composited versions often used by Death Battle, giving him those strengths and skills he would need for a fight like this. But let's go back, because while the literal Man of Tomorrow was obviously destined to get stronger as his namesake of the New Dawn came, I don't think anyone quite expected just how far Goku would go in just a short time. As on September 27th, 2015, just 70 short days after the death battle, Dragon Ball Super would air its 12th episode. And while yes, Dragon Ball Super's first two arcs were initially just retellings of the two feature-length films that came before it, seemingly justifying Death Battle's choice to release Part 2 before the series wrapped up, this particular episode, titled The Universe Crumbles, Clash, God of Destruction vs Super Saiyan God, made two seemingly minor changes in the grand scheme of the Battle of Gods arc, which blew the lid completely off Dragon Ball's power scaling forever, while also rendering the aforementioned Goku Vs Superman Part 2 completely outdated in a little over 2 months. The two changes in question being Goku and Beerus' legendary clash, which in this version, and all others besides the movie, sent ripples across the entire universe, as well as the afterlife, threatening to completely destroy everything in the Dragon Ball macrocosm's existence if Goku couldn't learn to control his power, all just by throwing a few punches, as well as Goku then having been confirmed to have permanently absorbed the power of a god into his regular base form, which meant that the Goku we see throughout the entirety of Super is stronger without ever transforming than he was in this universe-shattering god form, which is backed up in every continuity to be a power-up greater than every character from the rest of Dragon Ball Z's original run, from Buhan to a Super Saiyan 3 Vegito, who are more than capable of threatening the entire observable universe over time in their own right. And from there, the big shock is that Goku wouldn't ever stop going up again, unlocking the Super Saiyan Blue form, which is highly implied to be a 50 times amp over his god state, via the official Daizenshu, Toriyama, and Super Exciting Guide multipliers, then learning to stack that with the Kaioken from back in his old days, letting him move in frozen time, before going on to surpass that aforementioned Kaioken with his base blue, and clashing with an alternate evil version of himself as well. Before then finally ending up at the Tournament of Power, where his own power would only continue to skyrocket up as he developed and mastered the now iconic Ultra Instinct transformation, which managed to make him strong enough to shake an infinite void of endless eternity. And of course, would go on to defeat Dragon Ball's own resident Superman knockoff just 910 days after the death battle, with Jiren being a character who was stated to both have power surpassing the concept of time itself, and status far higher than any opponent before him, placing him even above the likes of an infinite Zamasu, who was fusing with the multiverse across multiple time streams and universes. This of course is also all without going on to mention Goku's manga continuity, which would continue for those next 5 or so years past the anime, showing him growing stronger and stronger as he further evolved his Ultra Instinct to new heights and limits. So if we're trying to compare this Goku directly with the one featured in Death Battle Part 2, you could literally say that by this point, he could beat his old Max Power movie iteration without ever even bothering to transform. And since he's now definitely been shown to be capable of stacking his OG God mode on top of his God-infused base, you can use some simple math to say with these dozens of different multipliers on top of a universal level base power, we're casually looking at a Goku here who's far more dangerous than he ever was before, to the extent that he may even be seeping into those higher dimensional tiers of power and speed once seemingly locked away only to the Western comic world. Even ignoring all the new techniques he's picked up since then, such as the auto-dodge and auto-attack features of Ultra Instinct, the ceiling powers of Mafuba in the anime timeline, and even the use of the existence erasing Hakai in the manga. But I think that when addressing the question of Goku vs Superman though, these recaps of what's changed over the years, while an interesting way to set the stage, don't really get to the root of why this question has stayed so elusive. And as someone who genuinely enjoys both of these characters, I think there's really one major disconnect that occurs between fans of DC and Jump Comics when discussing this particular topic that uniquely separates this fictional matchup from other ones like it, which has to do with a key difference in the way comics are written here in the West versus the East. So I'm gonna have to get a little bit meta with you here, but typically when we or Death Battle ask the question, who would win, in the fictional power scaling-esque sense, we gauge it in 2 simple ways: narrative and feats. Narrative includes all the things the author, story, and characters within those comics tell us about someone's power level, whereas feats are the actual things that occur on said pages of the comic, which are used as a way to show us readers someone's power level. The reason I bring up this distinction is because any time that a Western comic book character comes out to play, the lines between what's reasonable and not for these 2 categories is often put into a lot of question. To explain why, let's use a quote from the late Stan Lee, co-creator of Marvel Comics.
So one question I'm always asked: who would win in a fight? Who would win in a fight if Galactus fought the Hulk? Or if Thor fought Iron Man? And there's one answer to all of that. It's so simple. Anyone should know this. The person who'd win in a fight is the person that the scriptwriter wants to win. If I'm writing a story about the Thing from the Fantastic Four, and he gets into a big fight with Spider-Man, and millions of people out there say, who would win? Well, it depends on who I want to win if I'm writing the script. If I want Spider-Man to win, he'll win. If I want the Thing to win, he'll win. These are fictitious characters. The writer can do whatever he wants with them.
Now, when most people see this clip, they view it as Stan saying the concept of power scaling as a whole is pointless due to the fictitious nature of these characters. However, what most people tend to mindlessly gloss over here is that Stan is not just talking about fictional matchups as a whole, but instead the specific idea of actually writing a story for said matchups in a comic book. Using DC for an example, a fan favorite like Batman can't be losing to some random B-list villain like Gorilla Grodd, so if they fought in the comics, Batman would likely win no matter how strong you make Grodd, because it serves the plot and sales. But on the opposite hand, we know that if any real-world gorilla fought any real-world man, 1v1, which canonically both these characters are supposed to be, then that gorilla is logically stronger and should win every time. This is what separates the concept of power scaling from what Stan was talking about, removing things that the plot necessitates while using the events that have already happened as a gauge of strength to create an equal scenario where the most accurate or likely winner could be decided outside of a story. And this is why power scaling comic book characters, and especially Superman, is nigh impossible to do in the traditional way. because while Goku has only been written by a handful of people, covering something like 4 or 5 canon continuities in his entire near 4-decade publication history, Superman has been written by hundreds of writers across dozens of continuities over nearly a century of publication, each having their own take on this who would win question with the entire DC roster. And if you still don't quite get what I mean, here's a panel of Superman getting clobbered by Hawkman's Claw of Horus, which he says is essentially like being hit with a planet. And that seems fine, Superman is super after all, but then here's a panel of Superman surviving something 50 times the scale of a supernova, which could delete multiple solar systems. Or again, here's a panel of Superman yanking Darkseid out of the literal boundaries of existence in the form of the Source Wall, which sounds a little more impressive than a supernova, but then here's him getting knocked out by just flying into a moon. I mean, we could literally do this all day. Here's Clark saying his punches are only small planet level, then proceeding to literally fistfight a living universe named Nebula Man. Or Full Power Clark here struggling to lift a mountain on one page, and then managing to bench the entire Earth for days in another. Here's Clark getting toasted by a million nukes, and then here's him absorbing the power of a blast that would wipe out half a galaxy. Even looking at that awesome feat of Superman escaping the bounds of infinity that everyone loves to use, the panel that comes literally immediately after it is the Spectre stopping a pre-crisis, supposedly unlimited Superman dead in his tracks, making him admit, "I can't outfight you." Do you see my point here? When trying to measure out exactly where these comic book characters stack up compared to each other, how far do you take the inconsistent internal logic that writers force into the stories and promptly try to retcon or overwrite in the future? Like, we can all agree that things like Batman kicking the Spectre or punching Reverse Flash doesn't suddenly make him infinitely strong or infinitely fast regardless of the feat, because we know Batman is at the end of the day just a human. So when extending the same logic out to Superman's more ludicrous feats or calcs, it blurs the line because just as many times as Superman has taken on those cosmos-shattering threats, he's lost, struggled, needed power-ups, or outright died to much more grounded problems, with both types of events being equally valid in terms of actually happening on the comic pages. And while some people might then try to tell you that Superman's inconsistencies can all be whisked away by him holding back way too often, not understanding his own upper limits, or by just saying that I'm cherry-picking using feats and statements from across Soup's timeline instead of just a single story where he's at his best, the reason that logic doesn't work is because most major forms of Superman and his stories are part of greater overarching storylines or canon. So even when just taking one iteration into account, like the aptly named New 52 Soups from the New 52 continuity, it would logically lead you to look into all his equally relevant canon showings within said continuity, instead of just one story, which as you'd guess, still has a sea of different writers and stories featured within said continuity that will actively contradict themselves pretty often, without ever even trying to dip your toes into how all these separate continuities might scale to each other. And in the same vein, while Superman is definitely known for pulling his punches very often, or even having an incomplete understanding of his full potential across certain continuities, in many cases like the Shadow Moon above, Clark had zero reason to hold back short of dramatic effect, or more accurately, it's simply due to inconsistencies caused by having so many cooks in the kitchen. Why this isn't such a big deal for Goku or really most characters like I said, is because his canons are almost entirely separate with little to no overlap, leading to minimal doubt about who Goku can or can't beat within his own series, with the few exceptions that arise coming from a lack of context or inability to read. Unlike DC Comics, where the writers and thusly internal sense of power scale, both in terms of feats and statements, are constantly changing, leading to situations like this where Superman is implied to be the strongest in the Justice League, but then later implies himself that Martian Manhunter, for example, could solo him and maybe even the whole league. With all of this still ignoring the fact that even if we just try to grant certain feats for a specific character, those feats will still have a level of opinion and variability mixed in based on who's actually crunching the numbers. And all I'm basically saying is that there is little to no consistency within Western comic books, as the limits and abilities of these specific characters have to stay flexible to facilitate the massive crossover style events often seen in DC and Marvel, as well as the armies of writers who create them. whereas in manga it's oftentimes a singular story written by one person at the lead, with no crossovers or simple week-by-week plots to have to worry about derailing the linear overarching scaling of a story or character. Sure, at the end of the day, Goku has outliers too, both on the high and low end, like fighting an actual gag character, or this statement here, for example, where Buu Saga Goku implies he can barely lift 40 tons, but because the internal consistency and logic is way more steady within a single storyline, as opposed to, hundreds of them crossing over, we can fall back on our common sense and uncontradicted statements to tell us that Goku isn't at either of those two extremes because it's so inconsistent with the things around him. In Superman's case though, sure, you can definitely say he's above planet level, there's no doubt about that, he's among the strongest superhumans. But when even Clark himself isn't really all too sure about which heroes are stronger than him, due to a lack of clear single story backbone with linear power progression, where do you logically place him on a scale as wide as planetary to universal and beyond ranges? There's obviously evidence you could point at to suggest all or any of it is true, from the feats to in-universe statements and even general depictions, all depending on who you ask. So if that's the case, then this brings us back to the question of how can we or anyone else choose an unbiased winner against someone without a defined level of power? Death Battle's stated method is taking the fighters at their strongest. But to find their strongest, should we just ignore the low ends and use whatever their most charitable high-end scaling could suggest, without regard for anything else, which is in effect what Death Battle does? Or should we try to take the low and high ends into account equally and then use what's most consistent for both characters, going all out narratively, to try and find the version of this fight that is most authentic to the characters as a whole, as opposed to just their outliers? This question of which method you choose and the nuances of your decision are basically the line in the sand which divides current Goku vs Superman and Goku vs Superman 10 years ago. Because, especially with Death Battle's logic, Superman really isn't getting much stronger since he's had 100 years to gather feats of the highest quality, so just adding a canon excuse in the form of Superman Reborn for fans to use this composited Superman in a battle doesn't really bring the Man of Steel to any new heights necessarily, which isn't trying to detract from Rebirth's feats, as he does have some impressive ones, but when you're trying to add new scaling onto someone who already consistently broken every concept at one point or another, things get a bit more tricky than just blowing up some more planets. People genuinely view the symbol that is Superman and what he stands for as a hero without limit, who can overcome any obstacle, making him literally unbeatable. But on the opposite hand, because Goku is someone with one story, one adventure, one singular endpoint, and less than half the total publication length of the de facto superhero, this many years can make a genuine difference in where he stacks up, with Goku being stronger than he ever was in the past, rising to such heights and insane multipliers that even the Goku times Vegeta fusion of Gogeta and Vegito isn't necessarily stronger than his own personal individual strength anymore while using Ultra Instinct. And while some people would say that no matter how strong you get, you can't surpass something without limits, making Goku's growth sort of irrelevant, if you genuinely read and enjoy both series, even DC writers and the company itself have stated numerous times that at no point during his career was Superman ever boundless or unlimited. His story was never about being a perfect almighty god, but instead being someone with the strength of an ideal. A messiah-esque figure of godly status, yes, but one who took on the best qualities of what humanity had to offer. A physical, unwavering manifestation of truth and justice, who is meant to rise to the occasion and always stand against any evil, but also just a man who grew up on a Kansas farm, taught the American way. A man who can hurt, bleed, and feel all the same as us. All is a part of understanding that no matter how different we all are, even those of us who are alien to a land or culture are all united in our humanity. But in Goku's case, his story was never about others accepting him or expressing the concepts of heroism. Instead, it was a journey about a boy growing into his own as a man and martial artist, learning to embody all aspects of who he was born and raised to be, in pursuit of more than just raw power, but the concept of strength as a fighter and what lies beyond it. A person who never wants to stop growing, with Jiren in the modern day essentially serving as the mirror to Goku's dream and story, being the sort of person Goku thought he wanted to be in the past. an individual who represents absolute strength even above the gods. But through Goku's journey, every fiber of his being, from his warrior race heritage to his conviction to keep growing, granting him boundless potential, and even the strength of his past experiences becoming his literal and metaphorical strength as they come together to aid him through many points in his life, Goku is meant to be someone who continuously aims for greater horizons, not a person with absolute strength, who can never lose, but someone who will always rise to the occasion, not even for the sake of good or evil, but instead purely because that's his story and his wish. So understanding now that neither Goku nor Superman has, will, or ever should be a character with truly unlimited strength, based on how you view the ideas of consistency and high ends, here are my thoughts. If you are a person who values consistency in a character's power level, then the answer to this question is undoubtedly Goku. While back in the past, I think it would have been fine to say that Superman's showings of universal destroying or threatening power were more than consistent enough to contend with or outright outmatch a Battle of Gods Z-level or even GT Goku without ever having to dip your toes into the more outrageous stuff for Supes, Goku within the Super continuity has clearly risen up to that level, one that likely transcends all his canon iterations by an immeasurable amount. And in the case of Superman, scaling beyond that universe-threatening level becomes very contentious because no matter how you slice it, Clark is often portrayed as being rivaled by other Justice League members, avatars of Darkseid, and many others, despite what Outliers might suggest. And sure, Superman is fast too, but he and Goku both have speed that's nearly incalculable, if not blatantly infinite. And to say Superman is fast enough to just consistently rewind time like a max speed Flashpoint speedster just doesn't really seem too likely, considering he's consistently shown to be slower than the Flash, as well as the fact that this isn't really a power Superman is ever portrayed to use consistently, and one that he never uses within active combat without his max flying speed, especially during the post-Crisis years. And although some interpretations of Superman could probably laugh off a Mafuba or Hakai just like he does with the Destruction Incarnate Omega Beams, or sealing nonsense within DC, even his weaknesses and vulnerabilities are prone to more than a bit of inconsistency, which makes knowing for sure basically an impossibility, with things like Superman's magic vulnerability often fluctuating from a minor inconvenience to basically a second kryptonite, or even how this weakness in some comics is implied to extend to the concept of chi, letting a master of ki like Goku easily get the upper hand, but in others, Superman can literally use Torquasm Rao, which is like Superman plus chi in martial arts, which clearly implies he's not nerfed by it. So while yeah, you could go back and forth for days with this sort of thing, asking what could and couldn't affect Clark, at this point in time, with Goku being on a level of power genuinely capable of combating those reality-ending threats, having the strength to shatter dimensions and speed that surpasses time, at the very least, you just can't say that he and your average comic book Superman are all that far apart when going all out. Except Goku has a far wider arsenal of consistent abilities that amplify his power far more, coupled with combat skill that, for your usual depiction of Superman, would be far too much to handle, with it being in Goku's very nature as a character to push past or pursue certain new ideals of power and strength, as opposed to Superman, who's literally supposed to be one of those exact, unwavering ideals of strength, which Goku so often dreams of breaking his limits to surpass. But if you are of the opinion that everything is hyper-literal and we should just ignore contradicting evidence, then even if we say Goku is literally infinitely beyond every concept we know in real life, and we call him fifth dimensional, hyperversal, or whatever buzzword you like, he has almost no chance against a composite, inconsistent, high-vault Superman. Goku has infinite speed, that's fine. Superman can fight in negative seconds and fly faster than the Flash can run. Goku can destroy anything? Yeah, sure, Superman deals with potentially outerversal concepts on the regular, with multiversal beings like the Monitors being morning brunch for him practically. And since we're throwing any statement that says Superman loses out of the pile, then the S on his chest goes from representing an ideal of a regular man with limits of his own to an unhinged, wrathful god. Because when ignoring the actual character and just using all of Superman's greatest hits collection of Outliers, you're basically asking if Goku could 1v1 the author of the story who wanted Clark to win in that instance. His weaknesses will be at their least effective, or written out entirely. His limits will be at their least defined, and his intelligence alone would be so otherworldly that he could give Goku one look and literally know every single thing about him or that he will ever do, as if the writer just spoon-fed him the entire plot of Dragon Ball, because that's the sort of thing Superman can just do when the writers need him to. So if using that version of composite Superman, then the answer should be as obvious as night and day, with Supes probably mastering his own Ultra Instinct and punching Goku straight out of the multiverse before the battle ever begins. Now, does that really make sense as his upper limit? To me, that sounds no more realistic than saying Batman is out-reversal for kicking the same Spectre that pre-Crisis couldn't harm. So in my eyes, as someone who values the consistency and narrative integrity of a character a bit more than their straight hype, I believe Goku would probably win without extenuating circumstances, but I still firmly think that Superman will still be taking the win in the third installment of the Death Battle trilogy, because no matter how much Goku improves or changes, Death Battle simply treats comic book characters more along the lines of that other camp, and just as we recently saw with Vegeta v Thor or even Ben 10 v Green Lantern, they clearly still don't believe Dragon Ball characters, or most others, can stack up to that level of multi-generational absurdity that is found within Western comic books. But if you made it to the end with me, that's my current stance on the topic of GOAT versus GOAT, with all the current knowledge I've gained on it over the years. And if you think I was cooking with this one, consider subscribing since we're on a mission to hit 1K subs before the end of the year. It's free and means a whole lot, but regardless, I hope you enjoyed, and that's all for today. Thanks, everyone.